After making notebooks for over a decade now, I noticed that bookbinding becomes much easier once you know a few small tricks and build habits. So in this video, I would like to share with you some of my favorite practical bookbinding tips for beginners that helped me a lot while making books over the years. Hi, I'm Joanna. Welcome back to my missredfox paper art channel. It's all about bookbinding and paper crafts for beginners here. I've been binding books for around 12 years now, and I'm completely self-taught. I'm actually an engineer, later worked in advertising agencies, and eventually started my own graphic design business and finally my bookbinding studio, because I've always loved books and stationery. So most of these tips are things I learned through repetition, trial and error, and simply making many books over time. If you already watched my video about common bookbinding mistakes, this one is a little different. That video focuses more on problems beginners often run into, while this one is more about practical workflow tips and little tricks that make the process easier and more enjoyable. So let's start. Especially in the beginning, you really don't need professional tools or materials for absolutely everything. For practice books, for example, cereal box or ice packaging cardboard works just fine. A candle can work instead of beeswax for wax and thread. And homemade presses work surprisingly well too. I still use my DIY presses regularly. This one is made from kitchen boards, and this one is basically a brick. And you can even repurpose tools. For example, the smooth barrel of a pen or a wooden spatula can work a little bit like a bone folder for folding paper or smoothing paper signatures. But there are also a few things where quality really makes a difference. For me personally, that's definitely a good sharp blade, solid ruler, good liquid glue, a good bone folder, and high quality boards and papers. I'll link my video on paper and boards in the description below. I actually used a lot of glue sticks like this for smaller paper crafts and notebooks for many years, and they definitely work for some projects. This is quite good quality too. But for most bookbinding work, I now prefer liquid glue because it spreads more evenly, creates stronger bonds, and usually gives cleaner results too. If possible, I'd recommend using glue that is acid-free, pH neutral, and archival quality, because cheaper glue can sometimes become less flexible or make paper yellow over time. I also recommend rulers in different lengths because one ruler is usually never enough. Use metal ruler in general and a non-slip one for cutting, and use an edge to protect your fingers, and something with a very straight edge like a set square or a quilter square. They help a lot with alignment and accurate cutting. Especially if you also make boxes, because small inaccuracies become much more visible there. From all the bone folders that I have, my favorite ones are these Teflon ones, because they glide smoothly and usually don't leave shiny marks on paper. So if I would buy a bone folder, it would be a Teflon one. If you still want to have more traditional or professional bookbinding tools, I really recommend checking thrift stores, flea markets, or online secondhand marketplaces from time to time. Some older tools are extremely well made and can sometimes be found for a surprising low price if you are patient. For example, I found my antique book press online for only about 25 euros after searching for quite a long time, while similar presses are often much more expensive, so they can cost hundreds of euros. Mine has some cracks and dents in the cast iron, yes, but it still works perfectly fine and I just love it. I think paper and board grain is one of the most important beginner topics in bookbinding. Because even if everything looks correct at first, wrong grain direction can cause all kinds of problems later. Covers may warp or bend, pages may not turn nicely, and the book can simply feel stiff or awkward when opening. In the beginning, this confused me a lot because I didn't understand why some books behave so differently from others. So I really recommend learning about grain direction early on, because it affects almost every part of bookbinding. If you want a deeper explanation, I also made a separate video all about paper and board grain. It's linked in the description. One thing that makes a big difference is starting with properly square edges and corners. If the very first edge is crooked and the very first corner is not right angled, everything afterwards will probably become inaccurate too. This is also one of those situations where measure twice, cut once really helps. So after measuring and deciding where to cut, I usually begin with one stretch edge first, then use something like a set square or quilter square until all four sides are straight and square. Especially with decorative papers, I always try to pay attention to the pattern and its direction before cutting, because otherwise it is very easy to accidentally waste material or realize too late that the pattern is the wrong direction. For example, when I make envelopes for my notebooks, I even write an A on my template so I always know which side should point upward in the direction of the pattern. And that becomes especially important when you don't have much paper left or where the material is expensive. For covered books or boxes, clean 45 degrees corner cuts also make a big difference visually. I made these small DIY corner jigs for this because it helps keep the cuts much more consistent, and you can find the link to my video on this in the description. A fresh blade gives cleaner cuts, needs less pressure, and feels much nicer to work with. If cutting feels difficult, your blade is probably already too dull. Especially cardboard makes blades become dull quite fast. I change mine much more often now than I did in the beginning, so I'd really recommend keeping enough spare blades nearby for when you need them. Sometimes your ruler is simply too short for the cut you need to make. What I usually do first is then mark the measurements at different points with pencil. Then I connect those marks with a long straight line, and since I don't have a long ruler, let's suppose, I use something like the stretch edge of a cardboard. And after that, I cut only to a certain point. Shorter than the ruler. Then keep the blade where it is, carefully in place, shift the ruler further along the line, and then continue cutting. This makes the cut much straighter and more accurate. This saves so much measuring time. I make small cardboard spacer for things like hinge caps, cover paper edges, or sewing station spacing. You measure once and then reuse them again and again, which is especially helpful if you often make similar books. You could of course use 3D printed spacers too, or the width of a ruler as a spacer. I always keep waste paper underneath while gluing, and actually use this large A3 paper block for this, which is glued on the side. It keeps the workspace cleaner and protects finished areas from accidental glue marks. I reuse the sheets over and over again after the glue dries, so this block will last for ages. You can also use old magazine pages, but sometimes the printed color bleeds, so this is why I prefer white paper. If I press an entire book while the covers are still slightly damp from glue, I like to place something moisture resistant inside the book first to protect the pages from wrinkling. For example, parchment paper, pieces cut from plastic folders, or the shiny side of the backing paper from sticker sheets. Very simple but very useful. I also learned not to rush the pressing stage. Sometimes books still improve a little after resting overnight, so pages flatten more, covers settled, and the whole book often feels nicer next day. Glue builds up very quickly on rulers, scissors, brushes, bone folders, you name it, tools and fingers. So I try to wipe tools regularly while working and usually keep a small cloth or towel nearby for my hands as well. Clean and dry hands really help avoid glue marks, fingerprints or stains on paper. It's a very simple habit, but it makes the whole process cleaner and easier to handle. Of course, you should always clean your glue brush properly when you finish working for the day. Preparing the thread properly makes sewing much easier. I almost always wax my thread first because it helps prevent tangling and makes the sewing smoother. And if you don't have beeswax yet, a normal candle also works quite well. I also lock the thread onto the needle by piercing the thread tail at about 3 centimeters from the end with the needle itself. So it doesn't constantly slide out while sewing. And thread length matters much more than beginners often expect, especially with open spine bindings like the coptic stitch or Japanese step binding. Too short is frustrating because you may need to join new thread in the middle of sewing, but thread that is much too long also becomes annoying because it tangles while sewing. So I would really recommend finding measurements or formulas that work for your most common book sizes and writing them down somewhere. And if sewing holes become too large, you can often close them a little again with a bone folder. It makes the finished book look neater and more professional. When I count pages, I slightly shift the paper stack at an angle first. This makes the individual sheet edges much easier to grasp while counting. And I always count 5 pages, so it's easier to add afterwards. Otherwise, the pages sometimes stick together too much if the edge of the stack is too straight. I also heard that rubber fingertips used for sewing or office work can help with this too, although I personally don't use them. One thing I really recommend is keeping some kind of best practices notebook for recurring projects and ideas. Here I write down things like measurements, spacing or cutting layouts for projects I make repeatedly. For example, sometimes I sketch how to cut a large sheet of paper in the most efficient way, so I waste less material and can remember it later. It saved me a lot of time over the years and made repeating projects and books much easier and more consistent. Also, I recommend that you make yourself templates for the books you make more often, and this also saves quite a lot of time. One small thing that really helps while working is keeping your most used tools directly on your crafting table. I used to keep them in drawers and boxes, but now I keep my scissors, rulers, bone folder, awl, pencil, blades and other tools beside my workspace, so they are always easy to reach. It sounds very simple, but constantly searching for tools interrupts the workflow much more than people think. And honestly, I just like to surround myself with tools and objects that feel nice to use. As you can see, I keep mine in a few pretty mugs that I really like. When I make several books at once, I usually work in batches instead of finishing one complete book and then start a new one. So first I'll measure and cut all the boards, then all the cover papers and end papers or envelopes, then things like elastic bands or thread, and only afterwards I start assembling the books. For me, this is much faster, more organized, and also mentally easier because I stay focused on one type of task at a time. And it also works really well with the natural waiting times in bookbinding. So while covers are drying in the book press, for example, I can already count pages, fold signatures, or prepare the next steps. I think it's much better to begin with easier structures first and repeat them several times before moving toward more advanced bindings. This helped me improve much faster than constantly trying completely new techniques. If you repeat one type of book several times, you hence slowly build memory and each version becomes cleaner and more precise. This is a small but important tip. After every book, I try to notice what worked well and what didn't. Maybe the newly bought paper was difficult. Maybe a step took too long. Maybe I rushed something. Maybe the measurements were incorrect. Every project teaches you something for the next one. This is something I noticed over the years. Sometimes if I make a mistake early in the project, somehow the whole book starts feeling slightly off afterwards, or I make even more mistakes. Perhaps I become less confident, or I rush, or maybe I focus too much on fixing the first mistake. So sometimes those books need to become personal notebooks instead of shop pieces. Of course, one learns from mistakes, but I also think beginners often judge themselves much more harshly than necessary. Most people notice mistakes much less than we do ourselves. I think one of the nicest things about bookbinding is that many skills slowly develop through small adjustments and repetition. A ruler that's too short, tangling thread, paper that doesn't behave as expected. At first, these little problems can feel frustrating, but eventually you slowly become more confident solving them. And one day, many things that once felt difficult simply become part of your natural workflow. This may sound less practical than the other tips, but I still think it's important. Sometimes people are afraid to start making things because they think they are not creative, skilled, or experienced enough yet. Honestly, I still procrastinate sometimes myself, even with things I really love like bookbinding. I often feel like I need to be in exactly the right mood, or have the perfect idea first, or just have the time to make the project from start to finish. But many times, the motivation and the development of initial idea actually comes after starting and not before. At least in my case, and especially for totally new projects. And even making simple books teach you something. So sometimes the best thing you can do is simply begin and allow yourself to make imperfect things while learning. Well, these were some of my bookbinding tips and tricks for beginners. But of course, I still learn new things myself all the time, even after years of making books. And I think one of the nicest things about crafts is that there's always something new to learn, no matter your age. If you want more beginner-friendly tutorials, I also have videos about common bookbinding mistakes, DIY book presses, paper grain, you name it, and a whole playlist about bookbinding essentials. And you have your own favorite tips, feel free to share them in the comments. I'd love to read them. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions. Feel free to like and subscribe if you like this tutorial, and stay tuned for more bookbinding videos. Happy crafting!